Tonight, On America Decides, a high-stakes hearing. The president's nominee to run Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., on Capitol Hill today. As Republicans heap praise, Democrats are working to pick apart his views on everything from vaccines to abortion.
It's time to make sure that we blow the whistle on actually what your views are.
News reports have claimed that I'm anti-vaccine or anti-industry. I am neither.
Your commitment to combating chronic conditions that drive healthcare costs will be critical to our success.
Plus, funding freeze unfrozen? The White House now seeming to recalibrate its order to pause all funding on federal grants and loans. But what does that mean for those organizations relying on that money? And 2 million federal workers now get an offer, quit now, and get a severance package through the end of September. But is the president's latest move legal? Some Democrats say otherwise.
The president has no authority to make that offer. You were here before he was here, and you'll be here after he was here.
Let's start, though, tonight with CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion and CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi. Great to have both of you here. Nikole, let's begin with you. Where does the White House stand on Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his performance today?
Well, I think for the most part, they feel pretty good about it. Obviously, there were a number of Senate Republicans who felt that they are now willing to support him, or that he put the vaccine issue to bed, if you will, although many Democrats certainly feel to the contrary. And we saw many of them spar with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. over some of his past statements and views surrounding vaccines. But that being said, of course, this was the first of two hearings that we saw today in the Senate Finance Committee. Of course, Kennedy will be before the Senate Health Committee tomorrow, although Finance will be the one that decides whether or not his nomination should advance. Take a listen to some of the exchanges that took place earlier today during the hearing.
It's time to make sure that we blow the whistle on actually what your views are. At least we're starting.
We need to move
Senator,
on.
I support the measles vaccine. I support the polio vaccine. I will do nothing as HHS secretary that makes it difficult or discourages people from taking either of those
Anybody
vaccines.
who believes that ought to look at the measles book you wrote, saying parents have been misled into believing that measles is a deadly disease. That's not true.
So again, kind of when he was pushed on the issue, that's when we heard Kennedy kind of come forward expressing support, as you heard there, for things like the polio vaccine and the vaccine for measles. Of course, when he was on the Hill a couple of weeks back, he kind of mouthed something to reporters saying that he was in support of the polio vaccine. That was at a time where he came under a heavy criticism from Mitch McConnell, who, of course, is a polio survivor, saying, you know, any type of effort to discount vaccines like that certainly won't get you anywhere here in the Senate. I'm obviously paraphrasing McConnell's words there, but again, this was kind of really the first time we've heard him give a more full-throated defense of some of these vaccines. But that being said, as I mentioned, some Democrats still not buying it, feeling that he's only putting forth these views now to secure his confirmation.
Let's listen to what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had to say on another issue, abortion.
So, Mr. Kennedy, I'm confused. You have clearly stated in the past that bodily autonomy is one of your core values. The question is, do you stand for that value or not? When was it that you decided to sell out the values you've had your whole life in order to be given power by President Trump?
Senator, I agree with President Trump that every abortion is a tragedy, that we can't be a moral authority in this country.
Right.
Olivia, great to have you here as well. The president's coalition is built in part on support from opponents of abortion rights in the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Former Vice President Mike Pence has opposed Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination on the grounds of the abortion issue. He is opposed to abortion rights. So how is the White House, when you're talking to people there behind the scenes, looking at how this issue could affect his Republican support?
Well, it was one of the few things today that were called into question about his flip-flopping views. A lot of people questioning Robert F. Kennedy for being a pro-choice Democrat. Earlier, in this cycle. That's what he ran as, and now he is aligned politically, he says, with President Trump on the issue of abortion, saying that he is selected by Trump to run the Health and Human Services as the secretary there, and therefore it's his job to carry out Trump's will. He goes on to say in the rest of that quote that he believes we can't be a moral nation if we're allowing 1.2 million abortions to happen in this country. And also, as you point out, interestingly enough, it's the one issue that former Vice President Mike Pence is willing to come out and speak on and criticize Trump and his administration about, that he doesn't believe that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. really represents where the party is, where MAGA is. But White House officials are not exactly too concerned about that. Remember, Trump himself on abortion has had a long history on his own stances from 1980, where he said he was pro-choice, to now where he says he believes it should be left up to the states. And of course, he implemented those Supreme Court justices who ultimately overturned Roe versus Wade. So important to note that even though Trump has really gotten that Christian vote, he's gotten the evangelicals on his side. His Health and Human Services director says he's in line with him, but both of their histories suggest that perhaps this isn't the top priority for them.
Let's turn to the issue of immigration. Today, President Trump signed into law the Laken Riley Act. Let's take a listen.
This is a very important law. This is something that has brought Democrats and Republicans together. That's not easy to do. Laken did it. Laken did it. America will never, ever forget Laken Hope Riley.
Nikole, back to you on this issue. We saw some bipartisan support for this legislation. Do you believe that this is going to continue on Capitol Hill, or are Democrats now expressing a lot of criticism and reluctance in the wake of the mass deportations that are playing out across the country?
Yeah, I think the short answer is a hard no, Bob. I mean, obviously, we saw some Democrats support the Laken Riley Act even in the last Congress. But of course, it was Leader Chuck Schumer who didn't bring it up to the floor here in the Senate. But of course, now that you have Republican majorities in both chambers, that's why we saw it clear both the Senate and the House. And of course, becoming the first bill that President Trump has signed into law. Now, keep in mind the Democrats have expressed a willingness to work with Republicans, particularly on the issue of border security and immigration. But as you very well know, Bob, of course, while this is a top priority of President Trump, Republicans have made clear that they intend to fold a large chunk of that legislative policy into whatever big reconciliation package they put together. So that is likely to have to advance without much Democratic support, even though some Democrats have tried to reach out to work across the aisle, whether that may be on separate legislation, but knowing that Republicans really want to prioritize that reconciliation bill, it seems any chance to work across the aisle may be few and far between.
And Olivia, when you look at the White House handling today this issue of the federal freeze, what are you hearing? There's a lot of confusion, even in the press corps, about what exactly is going on with this executive order. What's the latest you can share about how the administration's handling its proposal on federal funding across the board?
Yeah, quite a confusing day here at the White House on what this exactly meant. Let me just walk you through what happened today and what we heard. First, we heard from the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, who told federal agencies in a memo that the freezing of aid had been rescinded. Then we heard from Caroline Leavitt, she's the White House press secretary, who wrote in a statement that this is not a rescission of the federal funding freeze, but Trump's executive orders on federal funding will remain in full force and effect. Essentially, what has happened is that Trump's executive orders that he signed last week about the federal about making sure that all federal agencies are in line with his priorities and his objectives related to DEI, related to his priorities on slimming down federal government. All of those that he signed last week were then directed through OMB through a memo out to these agencies, asking them to pause any of that federal funding so they could review all of these policies. What got rescinded today was the OMB memo, not the federal, or rather not the executive orders, but just the memo. So a little bit of a distinction there, but it was enough to cause a lot of chaos here at the White House, people questioning what this meant. But ultimately, that federal funding is still on pause until we are hearing from a federal judge in this case who who put a stay on that order that we will hear from on Monday, whether or not this federal funding freeze will be lifted, whether it will stay in place. Still a lot of questions tonight on what exactly this all means. But Trump himself saying that the reason why they're doing this federal funding is, one, to make sure that all of these programs are lined up with his priorities, but two, to stop the wasteful spending of government. So that's what we're hearing from White House officials tonight. That's what they're focused on.
Olivia, Rinaldi, and Nikole Killion, thank you. We appreciate you stopping by.